and welcome to the TDS Talking Early Years podcast. Each week we'll be joined by educational experts from across the globe offering exclusive insights, inspiration and guidance to help practitioners unlock the potential for learning in the early years. Hi, welcome back to TDS Talking Early Years with me, Alistair Bryce-Clegg, and my guest for these episodes, Steph Ainsworth. And today we are talking, we're going to delve a little bit more into what we talked about in episode 1, which is about things that educators can do to support their own resilience. And again, focusing on that fact that resilience is not just about bouncing back. It's not just about pushing through. It's about trying to have a stable and productive state of self-regulation that allows you to cope with both your work and your life.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Alistair. And it's also about being in resilient environments as well. So as you say, it's about it's a sort of quite a proactive thing, being resilient, where it doesn't necessarily automatically happen. And that kind of happening where we want to feel resilient is something that you can do things about as an individual, but it's also things that your setting can do things about as well. And I think in terms of just picking up on some of the things we were saying about the individual level last time, part of that proactive process is just the understanding of what's going on. So rather than just thinking, I feel rubbish, as we often do, don't we? We've had a busy day and you go home feeling a bit deflated, or all kinds of different feelings. The first step really is to think about, well, what flavour of rubbish is that? Do I feel overwhelmed? Do I feel angry? Do I feel embarrassed? So for example, if you've done had a lesson observation that didn't go that well, what is that feeling? And where is that coming from? So what are the kind of thoughts that are feeding into that feeling, where, and just by doing that and taking a step back, that can automatically take some of the heat out of it, but it can also help you to reframe things in a different way. So one of the models that one of my colleagues, Sue Beltman in Australia, uses with her students and some of her other colleagues over there is the ACT model. So it's kind of, the A is for awareness. So whenever you're feeling rubbish, it's like just try and think, well, why? What's the feeling? And then the C is about checking thoughts. So thinking, well, what is it that's happened today or just now that's making me feel that way? And then the T is about trying alternatives. So it's kind of, how can you think about it differently? And that's something, because it's really memorable, that's something that I use all the time when I'm teaching now, in university, where we tell our student teachers about it as well, because it's something you can do really quickly in the moment. And just by reframing your thoughts, it can have a bit an impact. So like, for example, let's say you've done a lesson and you think it was rubbish, and then you might think, right, okay, how am I feeling? And you might feel a bit embarrassed, you might feel a bit deflated, you might feel a bit worried. And then if you unpick why, you might think things like, well, the thought in my head is, I'm not good enough at this, maybe I should do something else, all those kind of things. But then the T, try alternatives, you can then do a bit of reframing and think things like, well, actually, everybody has bad lessons. I remember my colleague yesterday was telling me about how she did that thing and it was a disaster. It's part of the learning process. How can I just learn from this positively? So there's lots of practical things you can do as an individual that won't kind of protect you from all bad feelings, because that's not, life is all about ups and downs, but they can help you to feel a lot better and move through those kind of feelings without them kind of just bubbling and kind of growing as well.
Yeah, I think we're predisposed as human beings to look for that kind of reinforcement, whether it be positive or negative reinforcement. So when you start feeling like, oh, this isn't all going wrong, it's not going to work, then you just get yourself into that bubble. And again, people listening might be thinking, oh, haven't got time to stop. But I think what we're saying is that what we know about mental health and awareness and resilience is that you've, as an adult human being, you've got to put the work in. It won't just happen. if you want to make that shift, and again, we're going to talk in the next episode a lot about leadership and culture, but the fact that if you're in a setting that has that in place that says, right, this is what we do here, that makes it much easier than if you're that one person kind of on your own. But also remembering that, everybody, especially in the profession that we're in, where you don't quite know what's coming through the door, you might have 30, 50 children in front of you who are all bringing their own baggage through the door with them. So what you thought in your head was going to happen rarely does, but that happens to everybody. And again, I was talking to somebody the other day who's moved from year 6 to reception, deputy head, very well established, wants to move into headship, wanted some early years experience. And she was basically saying, I have had 15 years of really successful teaching where I felt like I was really good at my job. And I came to early years in September thinking I was going to breeze through it. And I've gone back to feeling like I just can't do this anymore. I don't understand play-based learning. I don't understand how you run a day where you're not saying to children, sit on the carpet, now go and do an activity, now come and sit on the carpet. So she said she felt a huge sense of failure. She was really pleased that she'd done it because it made her think about the colleagues in her school very differently. But she, well into a very successful career, was having those feelings again of like, I am not good enough, I can't do this. But in a culture where you can talk about that openly, that's really beneficial. But I think, again, there is a lot of culture in education around you wouldn't say you felt you were struggling because you'd be too worried that somebody might say, well, does that mean that you can't do your job then?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. First of all, I very much remember that feeling myself of feeling de-skilled when I went into early years because I'd been in Key Stage 1, and it's just so different, isn't it? And although somebody who's not used to it might think it's kind of that open-endedness makes it somehow easier, actually I found quite the opposite. It's that sort of, not got a structure and a scaffold, so what am I supposed
What are
to
you
do?
doing?
So actually, again, there are different kind of stressors, if you like, that can impact on your resilience depending on your experience, which age phase you are, etc. And you're absolutely right that team, the team culture of being able to be open and honest about how you feel, your strengths and weaknesses is really, really important. And I think everyone in that team has, a positive role to play in that. So leaders within that team, phase leaders, for example, can again model this openness. So I think it's great for them to talk about their rubbish lessons and the things they're feeling less confident about, and their struggles, as well as sharing their good practice. And I think that's one of those, if it doesn't already feel like it's in place in your setting, it's the sort of thing that it doesn't cost any money to do. It doesn't take any extra time because you're having team meetings anyway. You're bumping into each other all the time. Yeah. It's about a way of being rather than an extra job. And I think that is something that has a bit of a snowball effect as well. Once one person starts to open up, other people do. In the project we're doing at the moment, we've just finished lots of focus groups with teachers. So it was, you'd have to say 6 teachers, all from the same school, chatting away. And they kind of said, can you come next week? Because actually just that process of sitting and talking
about it, yeah,
teacher well-being, which is never just about well-being, because it ends up being about, the thing I find stressful is, and you get into pedagogy, you get into behaviour management, you get into everything.
Yeah.
So it's professional discussions, but with that kind of openness to it, where it's acknowledged that actually that is those professional behaviours are part of well-being, and we do need to talk about them. And actually everyone then joins in, and it's not like anybody's putting themselves on the line on their own. So that kind of talking culture is really important.
I think there's another element which is also partly linked to social media, which can be a blessing and a curse. And again, we talk about a lot in this podcast. Very few people post their honest pictures of early years on social media. You get the lovely polished ones. We know that, but still it gets into your head and you're still thinking, well, I haven't got that. But there is lots and lots and way more practitioner research out there, or research-based practice, where things like the work that you're doing, like I was talking to somebody in a setting the other day that was saying, it was a nursery, And they set everything up on a morning. It took them ages to set it all up. And then the children just came in and just cleared the space. And we were talking to them about this idea of your resilience, your own mental health and well-being. And I was saying, but why do you set it up? And they're like, because that's what you're supposed to do. And I was like, well, here's a really interesting bit of research that I found the other day, which is by Kate Parle, who's also from MMU, which is about how children gravitate to untidy spaces. And again, a piece of research has been done around young children and how they tend to prefer or choose spaces, not that like they're a mess, not like Stig of the Dump, but spaces that are on the cusp of being untidy because there's not then a formal expectation of. So I'm not saying everybody, oh, just leave your setting at the end of the day and walk out and switch the lights off. But that idea that we have to create this showroom for children to enter. And also the fact that if we have really, really focused activities that are only based around one objective, we're actually taking away lots of the potential for children to engage. But if you could take away loads of your morning setup and use that time differently. So it's again thinking about the personal discussion, but also having access to research that would support you as a practitioner in saying, well, look, you just actually don't need to do that. And you don't also need to do that. You could just do this instead.
Yeah, definitely. And it's having that permission, isn't it? Because there are a lot of kind of unspoken rules that you develop over time, depending on which schools you've been in, you teach your
Yeah.
training, etc.
Ofsted.
Yeah, exactly. And so yeah, one of the things that people talk about is that they really want a clear steer from their schools and their teams about, well, how fancy do my displays need to be? And
Yeah.
and obviously that's throughout the school. But in, like, say, in early years, it's the environment and the expectation workload around how you manage your environment is so central, isn't it, to the role? And I completely agree with you there. It's not necessarily do the best for the children if it's really overly controlled and you put all that time in it. It might not even be the best for the children anyway, like you say, because there's a risk of stifling the creativity.
And then your state ages afterwards setting up stuff. I think the other thing that research does, and I'm not necessarily suggesting that everybody has to go and wade their way through difficult research papers, but there are plenty of people like you and I who then decant that research and kind of put it out in ways that practitioners can access it. But that also gives you your conversation, it gives you your starter, it gives you your argument. Where if somebody says, no, I want your room set up for tomorrow before you go home, and you can say, well, actually, this research points to the fact that this is a much better for children, then it gives you that opportunity to make that challenge. Because I know in my own early years career, and certainly with the settings that I work in, especially in early years where often the people who are managing you have not got early years experience, so might see it, not always, but might see it as just being playing about or the stuff that you do until the proper work starts. Having that voice to be able to say, well, we don't need a maths display in our early years space because children are not looking at the wall. We don't need tricky words on the wall because they're not looking at either. I could use that time to do this instead, which is going to impact on their development. It's sometimes having that voice or that argument to be able to start that conversation. And that's where things like blogs, websites, research, as long as it's well researched, again, it's that issue that you find some right scary stuff out there, but that stuff can begin that conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is being recognised a bit more in some of the sort of official DFE documentation as well about that. Some of the research around whether displays can be more distracting than helpful, depending on what they are, etc. And I think that's always going to continue to be a bit of an area for debate. But certainly is worth questioning this idea that more is always better. And and when I think about all the time as a teacher that I just spent laminating and laminating, and you think, did any of that laminating make any difference to the pupils? And I read a really interesting book called, I don't know if you've come across it, something like The Really Lazy Teacher.
Right.
And it's not about teachers being lazy. It's a provocative title, but it's a really interesting book about pedagogy, and it's all about making the children do the work rather than you walking them through these
task-based things.
Yeah, and
it is.
I mean, that idea, and it's obviously great for well-being as well.
Yeah. And you're empowering children, and you're looking at those characteristics of effective learning, and that's what they are based on. Basically, the children doing the work, not like saying get the kettle on Tracy. The kids are going to do the work, but the idea that, I mean, I was the king of the ripple border. I did every border that you could possibly imagine. Again, you wonder, did my elves and the shoemaker display really? I mean, all the adults in the school liked it, but did it impact on the children? Probably not. So there is some good research out there about how we can do things that impact more, especially in the early years, on that kind of early play-based brain development, that take a lot of the work out of the typical, job of the early years practitioner. That actually, when you look at it in isolation, there are practitioners now who are not doing stuff that's much different to what I did in the 90s, which is not much different to what my mum did in the 60s. But yet it doesn't seem to have changed that much. Yes, there might be an interactive whiteboard and it might be on a tough spot, but a lot of the pedagogy is the same. So it's that weird thing sometimes where education sits as that little bubble in amongst society where it just stays as it always was with very little change. And that's where research can really help us to say, well, look, we know in terms of how children learn, neurodiversity, adults, mental health and resilience, these are things that will impact. And it's the reason we do these is just tradition and expectation. It's not actually linked to development.
Absolutely. No, I completely agree. You do think and a lot of the research has been there for a long time, but it's getting it into practice, isn't it? And obviously it's being aware of those other constraints that schools face that mean they feel it's very hard to make those radical shifts in practice as well. So
Yeah. And sometimes it doesn't have to be always radical. It can be a little bit more gradual. And I know in the next episode, we're going to talk about, how leadership can engender a culture of resilience, which is not the simplest. I'm not going to talk about now, otherwise we'll take away our content from next time. But it's not the simplest thing to do, but it is possible. But I think what we're kind of saying here is that there are things that you can do as an individual to help you to manage your own resilience, mental health and well-being. But there are also things that will support you in that, like research. And then we'll move into the idea that if you're in a space where there's a culture where you meet regularly to discuss this sort of thing, and it's openly discussed and valued, then you're far more likely to flourish than if you just keep thinking, I just need to get my head down and get to the end of the week and put 2 extra bottles of wine in my Tesco trolley to get me through the weekend. Especially, I remember we had the great misfortune and fortune of having 3 children under 5. And you would go and do a day in early years and a long day and then come home to your own gorgeous children who then did exactly the same thing. And I can remember that kind of feeling of exhaustion was like nothing else. But I didn't build in any strategies to support myself. I just literally powered through it and thought by powering through it, I was looking like a really, accomplished practitioner and a brilliant dad because I just went for it. And actually what I should have been doing was building in time, questioning those practices, and that would have had a much more positive effect on my resilience.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think when you're thinking about what kind of strategies you can employ as an individual, it can be quite helpful to think it into 3 categories of strategies or resources. So Sue Beltman, again, one of my colleagues, talks about personal, interpersonal, and organisational resources. So it's kind of personal resources are things like, for example, cognitive strategies that you can use, as we've just mentioned, like trying to reframe things, trying to engage in self-care, the usual. I know it's really cliche, but actually exercising regularly, eating well does make a difference. So I've always been quite, I don't know, roll my eyes at that kind of thing. And because it's a bit like, well, is it really going to make that much difference? But when we did a survey with teachers where we looked at which things have the biggest impacts on how you feel as a teacher, and one of the ones that came out as being important was self-care. So it kind of showed you that the actual numbers kind of proved, if you like, that if you do those things, so you don't drink too much and you exercise and you eat well and you get enough sleep, you do actually have lower levels of stress higher levels of well-being, lower levels of risk of burnout, even though that all these people are in the same job. You see what I mean? And it
Yeah.
kind of surprised me in a way, because you sort of think of it like, well, teaching's difficult, and workload's high. So is it really going to make a difference if I go for a run or have an apple? But
Instead of
actually,
a chocolate bar, yeah.
I think there's something about that. I'm not saying it makes all the difference, but it does make a tangible difference. Because psychologically as well, I think the fact that if you're putting yourself first by doing those things, you're giving yourself a very strong message of I matter, and yes, my job matters and the children matter, but also I do as well. And
Yeah.
that, it's sort of, that has a knock-on effect on everything else that you do, I think, and how you feel. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think on that note, it's a really good place to end this episode. And we keep coming back to this idea: the conversation is important, but also we have to be proactive in our own resilience and mental health, and that can be difficult. But when we do it, the knock-on effect is worth it. So thanks, Steph. As always, fascinating. In the next episode, we're going to touch a bit more on leadership and culture. But for now, that's it from me, Alistair Bryce-Clegg, and my guest, Steph Ainsworth. Thanks, Steph.
Thank you.
I'd like to say a huge thank you to our guest, Steph, for joining us and providing us with such valuable information and insights. You've been listening to the TDS Talking Early Years podcast with me, Alistair Bryce-Clegg, and Steph Ainsworth. Now, if you've been inspired by our conversation today, then don't forget you can sign up via the link in our episode notes and be the first to hear about future episodes and access exclusive follow-up content that will include ideas for your setting and links to loads of relevant resources.